Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're doing a deep retrospective, looking back at the last 25 years or so. We're focusing on those big controversies, the ones that were everywhere. Headlines, political fights, creating real anxiety, but have since, well, kind of stabilized or cooled down in the public square.
It's a really important thing to do, I think, because we're not just, listing arguments from back then. We're digging into the cycle of these controversies, trying to understand the deeper currents, the stuff that isn't always obvious, like what actually determined when and why these really heated debates, things like stem cells, globalization, all that shifted,
Yeah.
from being brand new through that intense conflict phase and then into something, well, more normal.
Exactly. Our listeners have given us a fantastic set of sources covering the start of the century, and our job really is to cut through the noise of history, find those key insights. For each issue, we need to nail down what the core conflict was, what evidence both sides were actually using, and this is crucial. Where does the minority view stand today? Is it seen as, like, justified caution, or has society basically pushed it to the margins, made it seem fringe?
Precisely. It's really a deep look at how societies digest huge changes. We'll move through four main areas where you see this friction: science and medicine first, then social and cultural shifts, politics and policy adjustments, and finally those big global systems around energy and economics. And we're starting where often scientific progress sort of offered an ethical escape route.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive into section one then, the cooling of science and medical ethics. This is where, as you said, tech or policy often paved the way for things to calm down.
And the perfect place to start, I think, is that moral lightning rod from the early 2000s, stem cell research.
Oh yeah, that peaked hugely during the Bush administration, didn't it? The conflict was stark. This amazing potential of embryonic stem cells, ESCs, against the profound question of the moral status of a human embryo. The scientific excitement was just palpable, but the political backlash was immediate and very strong.
Yeah, that political context is absolutely key. The pro-research side was really driven by the dream of regenerative medicine. ESCs are pluripotent, meaning they can basically become any type of cell in the body. Think Parkinson's, type 1 diabetes, spinal cord injuries. The potential seemed immense. Proponents also stressed, that these cells came from discarded IVF embryos that, in many cases, were slated for destruction anyway, and they talked about strict oversight.
And the political response was, well, highly restrictive. I remember the federal funding limits under Bush. It wasn't a complete ban on the research itself, but it massively constrained which existing cell lines could get federal money. Essentially, put a freeze on a lot of the work, especially at public universities.
Exactly. And the anti-research side, it's important to remember, wasn't really questioning the medical potential. Their argument was fundamentally ethical, deontological. They assigned full moral status to the embryo from conception. So for them, destroying an embryo, regardless of the potential good down the line, was simply unethical. The core argument was that classic line: the ends don't justify the means. They pushed hard for alternatives like adult stem cells or cord blood, which were already in use for some things.
So you had this incredibly polarized debate, policy literally squeezing the research. How did it finally start to cool down? It sounds like a complete deadlock.
It really was an impasse, and it was broken fundamentally by a technical leap, a breakthrough that offered an ethical way out: the development of induced pluripotent stem cells, iPSCs. This was in 2006. Shinya Yamanaka, a Japanese researcher, demonstrated something remarkable. You could take ordinary adult cells like skin cells, and using just 4 specific genes, these Yamanaka factors, you could reprogram them, turn them back into an embryonic-like state, pluripotent.
Wow. That's a staggering innovation. So basically getting the same biological capability, that pluripotency, but without needing to use or destroy a human embryo at all.
Exactly right. The iPSC discovery offered this elegant ethical compromise. It was adopted pretty rapidly worldwide, and it effectively bypassed the political stalemate that had defined the previous decade. Now, the strong opposition to using ESCs still exists, and it's internally consistent within its own moral framework. But in the mainstream science and policy world, ESCs are now mostly used for niche research, maybe certain developmental studies where iPSCs aren't quite there yet.
So the minority stance today is seen less as a scientific counterargument and more as a specific values-based position. And this pattern where the core tension shifts but doesn't disappear, you see that clearly when you link it back to the earlier cloning panic and then forward to the current debates about gene editing, right?
Absolutely. Remember Dolly the sheep back in the mid-90s? That sparked this huge, immediate moral panic about human cloning, designer babies, all that. While that specific fear has cooled, we generally have strong global bans on human reproductive cloning. The underlying ethical tension just migrated. It moved right into the current discussions around CRISPR technology.
Because CRISPR and similar tools make inheritable genetic changes much more feasible, cheaper, and faster than cloning ever could. Our sources make a clear distinction here, don't they, between two types of editing?
Yes, a critical distinction. We generally accept somatic gene editing. That means treating the body cells of an existing person for a disease. Those changes aren't inherited. It's becoming part of standard medical research. But germline editing, making changes to eggs, sperm, or embryos, that ensures the modification gets passed down through generations. That remains highly contested, and in most places, it's effectively paused.
And the caution there seems pretty justified, doesn't it? You get the multi-generational risks, future generations unable to consent to changes in their own genome, and those slippery slope worries. Fears about societal pressure towards eugenics or selecting for non-disease traits.
Right. The scientific community essentially managed the debate, moving it from this sort of abstract fear around cloning to concrete governance issues around inheritable editing. The cooling came from policymakers hitting the pause button on the riskiest applications.
Okay, let's pivot now. Staying in science, but moving to food. Genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
Oh, that was a fierce battle, wasn't it? Late 90s through the 2010s, especially intense in Europe. The controversy had two main prongs, it seems. Public worries about human safety and deeper ethical concerns about, corporate control of food and life itself. The pro-GMO side consistently relied on, and still does, a very broad scientific consensus. Major international bodies, the WHO, AAAS, the European Commission, they've all repeatedly found that the GM foods currently on the market are as safe as their conventional counterparts. And they point to tangible benefits. Potentially higher yields for a growing world population, reduced pesticide use in some cases. Think insect-resistant crops and nutritional boosts, the classic case being golden rice, engineered to fight vitamin A deficiency.
But the skeptical side mobilized huge public energy, didn't they? They really hammered on the unknowns and the systemic issues. They raised valid points about long-term ecological impacts, like the massive rise in herbicide resistance linked to chemicals like glyphosate. That's still a major concern.
And crucially, they brought up economic justice, corporate control over seeds through patents, the use of sterile seeds, the sheer market power of giants like Monsanto back then. The right to know through mandatory labeling became this huge public rallying cry, leading to those state-by-state fights in the U.S.
So if the scientific consensus on safety is pretty solid, how is that minority anti-GMO stance viewed today?
Well, strong anti-GMO sentiment definitely persists, particularly in certain cultural groups, often tied into movements around organic or local food. Scientists tend to view the purely safety-based concerns as more cultural or driven by the precautionary principle rather than current evidence. However, and this is a really important nuance in the sources, the critiques focused on corporate power, on seed IP, on the impact on small farmers, the economics of monoculture that GMOs often reinforce. Those criticisms are widely seen as legitimate. They're viewed as justified concerns that the policy environment really didn't grapple with effectively.
That's a key difference, isn't it? Arguing the tech itself is dangerous versus arguing the system controlling the tech is flawed or unjust. That's vital for our listener to grasp.
Absolutely. Okay, last one in this science section, and it's maybe the clearest success story, the ozone hole and CFCs.
Right, this one cooled because policy worked decisively based on clear, undeniable science. The big debate in the 80s and early 90s was whether chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, really needed that rapid global phase-out under the 1987 Montreal Protocol.
The proponents had incredibly strong evidence from atmospheric chemistry. They showed how CFCs were depleting ozone in the stratosphere, creating this huge risk from increased UV radiation. And crucially, they had feasible substitutes ready to go for things like refrigerants and aerosols. The skeptics, often backed by industry then, pointed to uncertainties in the atmospheric models and warned about, devastating economic costs if they had to retool entire global industries so quickly.
But the outcome here is pretty much settled history. It's the textbook case of successful, fast global environmental action. Satellite data, balloon measurement, they confirmed the science. The ozone hole was real, it was growing. And then the documented recovery of the ozone layer after the phase-out really cemented it.
Yeah, continuing to deny the ozone problem today is firmly in the fringe category. It's just not seen as justified dissent, given the overwhelming evidence and the measured recovery trends we see year after year. The cooling happened because the facts lined up perfectly with the policy outcome. It worked.
That's a great contrast. When the evidence is that clear and policy acts effectively, the debate really can settle. Okay, let's shift gears now. Section 2, social and cultural shifts. These are debates that cooled, often because the law changed or generations turned over, setting new baselines for what's considered normal.
And probably the most dramatic, rapid shift here is same-sex marriage. I mean, it went from being one of the absolute most divisive political and legal issues in the 2000s, often triggering state constitutional amendments, to being legally recognized and widely accepted in many countries today.
The core controversy was fundamental, wasn't it? Should the state institution of marriage include same-sex couples? The arguments for it were really grounded in equal protection under the law. Proponents stressed that civil marriage is a state function separate from religious ceremony and that denying access caused real, tangible harm.
And those harms were concrete things. Tax inequalities, being denied hospital visitation, problems with inheritance, even just the basic legal framework to dissolve a partnership. Plus, you had decades of social science data accumulating, consistently showing that kids raised by same-sex parents had comparable outcomes. That really dismantled the argument that these unions somehow harmed families.
On the other side, the opposition often appealed directly to tradition and teleology, that philosophical idea that things have an inherent purpose. They argued marriage was historically defined by procreation and this idea of complementarity between sexes. They also raised concerns, sometimes framed as religious freedom issues, about whether recognizing same-sex marriage would force religious groups or individuals to participate in ceremonies against their beliefs, though often that was more about recognition than participation.
What's really striking is how quickly it resolved in many places. Often a key Supreme Court ruling combined with these really fast shifts in public opinion polls settled the legal question. Today, opposition is definitely a minority view in many countries. It's often framed explicitly as being rooted in faith or tradition. And while it's seen as justified within those specific doctrines, the legal framework and broad public opinion have moved strongly towards equality.
That generational factor was huge there, as we'll touch on later. Younger people just didn't see it as radical, they saw it as fair. We see a similar, maybe slightly slower normalization trend with cannabis legalization.
Absolutely. Cannabis went from being, the ultimate gateway drug, heavily prohibited, to being widely legal for medical and increasingly recreational use in many U.S. states, Canada and elsewhere, all in maybe less than 2 decades.
The arguments for legalization were really multifaceted, weren't they? You had powerful social justice arguments looking at the huge costs of criminalization, the massive racial disparities in arrests and incarceration. That was a big driver.
Definitely. And beyond the justice angle, you had the economic arguments, the potential for significant tax revenue, and the strategic aim of taking business away from illicit markets. Plus, the evidence for medical benefits for things like chronic pain, glaucoma symptoms, chemo side effects. That provided a solid rationale for medical use first, which kind of acted as the thin end of the wedge.
But let's make sure we capture the anti-legalization side too. They focused on real public health risks, didn't they? What were their strongest points that still hold weight today?
Their core arguments centered on health. Things like the impact of today's high-potency THC on developing brains, especially adolescents, the real risks of dependency or triggering psychosis in people who are vulnerable, and immediate public safety concerns, particularly around impaired driving. They worried that commercialization would normalize use, leading to more overall harm, especially for young people.
So where does it stand now? It seems like a strong trend towards legalizing and normalizing, but the debate has shifted, hasn't it? It's now more about how to regulate.
Exactly. It's about best practices for regulation. How do you tax it effectively? How do you control potency levels? How do you enforce impaired driving laws? That's where the friction is now, the strict prohibitionists. They're definitely a minority in many places now. Their perspective is still seen as, validly cautionary from a public health standpoint. Concerns about youth use and traffic safety are absolutely considered justified in the sources, but those arguments are increasingly being outweighed, in the public sphere at least, by the arguments about criminal justice reform and the allure of tax revenue. It's a pragmatic cooling driven largely by a kind of cost-benefit thinking.
Okay, now let's tackle a social debate that's still very much active, quite polarized in places, but where the baseline has still shifted significantly since the early 2000s, transgender visibility and rights.
Yeah, this is a broad and complex area. It covers everything from basic legal recognition, anti-discrimination laws, access to healthcare, participation in sports, use of public facilities. It's multifaceted. The cooling, such as it is perhaps best seen in the normalization of legal non-discrimination protections, particularly in workplaces and some institutional settings.
The affirming arguments there are centered on dignity, equal protection, and the evidence showing that access to appropriate, evidence-based care and supportive environments improves well-being and mental health, while discrimination, conversely, has real, measurable, negative costs.
Those arguing for more restrictions or caution often focus their concerns on specific high-stakes areas. You hear arguments about needing more long-term data before setting standards for medical interventions for minors, and concerns about fairness or safety in women's elite sports. These are areas where the precautionary principle often gets invoked by adherents.
So while the political and legislative battles are still pretty intense, you're saying the fundamental ground has shifted.
I think it has, in many Western contexts at least. Legal recognition and workplace protections are much more advanced than they were 20 years ago, when just getting basic legal recognition was often a huge hurdle. Outright denial of a trans person's identity or legal existence is now a minority stance within many major institutions and legal frameworks. The caution, as we said, tends to focus on specific domains like youth medicine or elite sports. Adherents see this as justified caution. Supporters see it as often overbroad and harmful. So the debate's intensity is now often focused on these specific applications rather than the fundamental right to exist and be protected from discrimination.
That distinction is really key, isn't it? The fight moving from existence to specific access helps understand how even a hot controversy can show signs of partial cooling or reframing. Okay, let's move to Section 3. This is where public opinion shifted, often due to historical hindsight or the sheer cost of government actions becoming undeniable.
And we absolutely have to start here with the defining political event of the early 21st century, the Iraq War and the whole expanded war on terror framework that came with it.
Right. This was incredibly polarizing, dominated everything in the mid-2000s. The arguments for intervention, back when the invasion happened, relied on a few key premises, didn't they? Preempting the supposed threat of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, the goal of bringing democracy to the region, and establishing deterrence after 9/11. The sense of urgency and threat felt overwhelming at the time.
But the anti-intervention arguments, which have largely won out in the historical consensus, pointed out the critical flaws right from the start. The faulty intelligence relying on questionable sources like curveball, the debates over things like aluminum tubes. They also warned about the inevitable high civilian costs, the risk of destabilizing the entire region through sectarian violence, and crucially, the erosion of civil liberties back home.
And the cooling here wasn't really about one side winning a policy debate, was it? It was about the evidence on the ground changing undeniably over time. The complete lack of WMD stockpiles, the emergence of a brutal insurgency, the sectarian civil war, and then later the rise of ISIS. It just fundamentally changed the justification narrative.
Absolutely. The historical reassessment now is overwhelmingly critical. You had major inquiries, like the Chilcot inquiry in the UK, meticulously documenting the failures in intelligence and planning. That initial, sometimes quite fervent support for the invasion, it's definitely a minority view in the West now.
So what's the basis for the minority stance today, the unapologetic defense of the war?
It's pretty niche. It's often framed in terms of strategic realism, arguing maybe that Saddam Hussein himself was a threat that needed removing, regardless of WMDs. Or sometimes it relies on the idea of unknowns at the time, justifying extreme precaution. But that position is widely contested, just given the sheer scale of the negative outcomes. The tragic loss of life, the regional instability, and the immense financial costs. Some estimates put it in the trillions of dollars. The controversy cooled, in large part because the tangible costs just dwarfed the projected benefits so decisively. And frankly, public fatigue set in. People just got tired of it.
And that outcome, the growth of the security state, directly fed into the next big controversy, mass surveillance and things like the Patriot Act. The peak friction there was really post 9/11, building up to that huge public reaction after the Edward Snowden leaks in 2013 revealed the scale of bulk data collection.
The argument for surveillance, especially in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, was driven by this idea of absolute risk minimization. It was pretty simple. These programs stopped terrorists. The claim was that analyzing metadata allowed agencies like the NSA to connect the dots globally. They insisted it mainly targeted foreign threats and that oversight, like the secret FISA court, was adequate.
But the anti-surveillance side, civil liberties groups, privacy advocates, legal scholars, they argued against mission creep. They warned about the chilling effect on free speech and association. And they highlighted the fundamental problem of collecting vast amounts of data on innocent citizens through programs like PRISM or under Section 215 of the Patriot Act.
And crucially, they pointed to independent government reviews. Those reviews often found that these huge bulk collection programs provided minimal, sometimes zero, additional security benefit compared to more targeted surveillance methods already available. The cost-benefit analysis seemed to fail on both effectiveness and constitutional grounds.
So has this one actually settled? Public outrage has definitely faded, but the programs haven't entirely disappeared.
It's cooled publicly, yes. The initial shock has worn off. The sources show some reforms happened, like the USA Freedom Act in 2015 ending the NSA's bulk phone metadata program and adding some transparency. But it's probably better described as an ongoing, lower-intensity tug-of-war. It's about scope, transparency, executive power. It's not really a fully settled issue like, say, the ozone layer.
Which means the minority view that unqualified defense of mass bulk surveillance is really only justifiable if you prioritize minimizing risk above absolutely everything else. But it faces constant, strong criticism on constitutional and rights grounds from almost every major civil liberties organization.
Yeah, it seems in this policy area, controversies tend to cool when the original justification, like preventing another big attack, is either shown historically to be flawed or when the cost, whether in liberty or money, just becomes too high for the public to stomach anymore.
That's a great summary. Okay, let's shift to Section 4. This is about global systems energy, economics, where changing costs and the growing climate crisis really reframed the whole discussion.
Let's start with renewable energy economics. Back in the early 2000s, this wasn't primarily a climate debate, it was an economic one. The dominant question, often quite skeptical, was, are wind and solar actually viable at scale? Or are they just expensive, unreliable, niche players needing endless subsidies?
Right. The narrative back then was all about intermittency and cost. If you look at the economics 15, 20 years ago, natural gas looked like the obvious bridge fuel because renewables just seemed way too expensive.
But the pro-renewables argument gained incredible, undeniable momentum because of one key factor: the learning curve. The cost of the technology plummeted. Solar panels, wind turbines, their costs dropped dramatically due to things like mass production, especially in China, technological improvements, standardization. They became competitive with new fossil fuels, and then, in many cases, cheaper.
We're talking about the levelized cost of energy, LCOE, right? That metric.
Exactly. The LCOE for utility-scale solar and wind fell something like 80, even 90% over a decade or so. And this eliminated fuel price risk. Once you build the thing, the fuel, the sun, the wind, it's free. That was huge. Plus, proponents demonstrated that reliability issues could be managed through diversifying wind often blows when the sun isn't shining and integrating with improving battery storage technology and smarter grids.
Skeptics definitely raise real engineering challenges. Intermittency is still a factor to manage, upgrading transmission grids is expensive, and there are local land use and visual impacts. Those concerns haven't vanished.
No, they haven't. But their core economic argument, that renewables were fundamentally too expensive, that collapsed. So, the resolution status today. There's a broad global consensus that renewables are absolutely central to decarbonization. The hardline argument that renewables just can't scale up is increasingly a minority view. It often sounds more ideological now than based on current economics. While local grid issues and transmission bottlenecks are still very real, justified operational problems to solve, the fundamental economic case against the technologies themselves just isn't persuasive anymore.
And this massive shift in renewable economics also completely changed the conversation around nuclear power, didn't it? Nuclear went from being almost a pariah after accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima to being seen by many climate advocates even as a necessary part of the solution.
Yeah, the central controversy today is really about its role in a grid trying to decarbonize. The pro-nuclear arguments emphasize its unique strengths. It provides firm, reliable, low-carbon baseload power. That's crucial if you want to replace coal and gas plants that run 2047. They also point to new, supposedly safer designs like small modular reactors, SMRs, and argue that nuclear's life cycle emissions are actually very low, comparable to wind and solar, making it a powerful climate tool.
But the anti-nuclear arguments are still potent and deeply rooted, aren't they? There's that understandable catastrophic risk aversion. Even if accidents are low probability, their potential impact is huge. That still drives a lot of opposition. Plus, you have the unresolved issue of long-term radioactive waste disposal. That's a political nightmare. And the simple facts of high upfront costs and long construction times compare to how quickly you can deploy renewables and storage now.
Right, so the debate isn't fully settled. But opinion has definitely shifted, particularly within the climate community, towards accepting nuclear as potentially part of the mix. Hardline, complete opposition is much less mainstream in climate circles than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. The remaining opposition is still justified for those who prioritize absolute precaution against disaster risk, or who are really focused on the history of cost overruns and project delays in the nuclear industry.
Okay, moving from energy to trade. Let's look at how globalization and free trade got reframed. For decades, the prevailing wisdom, especially in the West, was that liberalizing trade was just inevitable progress, right?
That was the old consensus, yeah. It celebrated comparative advantage, driving global growth, lowering consumer prices, lifting millions out of poverty, especially in Asia. It was often presented as a win-win. But the controversy, or rather the consensus, shifted dramatically after the 2000s. And it was driven by measurable pain felt domestically in many developed countries.
The skepticism wasn't just philosophical anymore. It was rooted in economic data. Skeptics pointed to the really concentrated, devastating costs of offshoring and deindustrialization in specific regions. Those China shock studies by economists like Otter, Dorn, and Hansen were pivotal. They tracked permanent job losses and wage stagnation linked directly to import competition in manufacturing zones.
Exactly. That academic work gave real teeth to the critiques. Critics also highlighted rising inequality within rich countries, not just between them, and the fragility of these long, complex global supply chains, something the COVID pandemic exposed brutally.
So the resolution, or the current state, isn't really a return to old-school protectionism, but a completely different consensus.
Correct. That old, almost unquestioning belief in liberalization is largely gone. The new focus is more on reglobalization with guardrails. The conversation shifted towards things like supply chain resilience, domestic industrial policy governments actively subsidizing key industries, and ideas like friendshoring, trading more with allies. Pure cost efficiency isn't the only goal anymore.
So that kind of unconditional free trade boosterism, that's now a minority view among policymakers. The skepticism is seen as broadly justified, especially given the hard evidence that the negative impacts on certain communities and workers were badly underestimated or ignored by the old consensus.
Okay, our final topic in this section is that classic clash between science and culture, the evolution debate. Specifically, should non-evolutionary ideas like creationism or intelligent design, ID, be taught in public school science classes?
The scientific case is, well, overwhelming. Evolution is the unifying theory of all biology. Supported by mountains of evidence from fossils, genetics, direct observation, it's fundamental to modern medicine and biology.
The arguments for including ID or creationism often revolved around notions of fairness or teaching the controversy, pointing to supposed gaps in evolutionary theory or arguing that complexity implies design. They also frequently use that line about evolution being just a theory, misrepresenting the scientific meaning of theory.
And the cooling here was largely driven by legal and academic consensus, wasn't it? Key court cases, like Kitzmiller v. Dover back in 2005, were critical. They legally established that intelligent design is a religious viewpoint, not a scientific one. That reinforced the principle that science classes must stick to methodological naturalism.
That term, methodological naturalism, is absolutely key. It means science, by its nature, seeks natural explanations for natural phenomena. Since ID inherently invokes a supernatural or non-natural designer, it falls outside the scope of science, regardless of anyone's personal faith. It can't be taught as science.
So pushing for creationism in science class is now definitely a minority position outside of certain specific communities or regions. Adherents might see it as an issue of religious freedom or balancing worldviews, but it fundamentally clashes with established legal precedent and the standards of science education. The mainstream debate has largely settled on that legal line.
Wow. Okay. This whole journey from stem cells to evolution to free trade, it really highlights the power of evidence in economics, but also shows their limits when they run up against deeply held values. Which brings us perfectly to our final section, digging into those deeper reasons why controversies truly cool down.
Right. This is where we try to connect the dots, find the aha moments. Why did same-sex marriage cool because of generational change, but the ozone hole cooled because of direct observation, and the Iraq War cooled because of historical costs and outcomes? The answers often lie beneath the surface arguments.
Okay, let's break these down. Insight A. The fight is really about legitimacy, not just facts. The facts might be available, but how they're interpreted depends heavily on who you see as the credible authority. Precisely. On the surface, people argue about the climate model, the economic forecast, the medical trial data, but the deeper struggle is often over who gets to define truth for that particular issue. Is it the scientists, the government, corporations, religious leaders? When that recognized authority shifts, the whole debate can pivot.
The climate change example is perfect here. Denial lost significant ground, not necessarily because every skeptic suddenly accepted the atmospheric physics, but because major institutional authorities, big business, finance, the military, insurance firms, started treating climate risk as real. They began actively planning for it, modeling it. That shifted the authority baseline from it's a political debate to it's an economic and strategic reality.
Insight B is simpler but maybe more profound. Generational turnover is the quiet decider. Basically, many issues don't end with a knockout punch argument. They just fade as older generations are replaced by younger ones with different baseline assumptions.
We saw that so clearly with same-sex marriage. The polls didn't just edge upwards, they flipped dramatically because millennials and Gen Z came of age seeing equality not as some radical social experiment, but as a matter of basic fairness. They essentially outgrew the controversy.
Next, Insight C digs into psychology. Moral intuitions drive, evidence follows. Work by moral psychologists suggests we often reason backward. We have a gut feeling, a moral intuition, maybe based on core concerns about harm, purity, liberty, loyalty, and then we construct the rational arguments and find the evidence to back up that feeling.
Which explains why these debates get so heated, right? You're not just arguing against someone's calculation, you're challenging their deeply felt sense of right and wrong. Stem cell opponents often had this visceral reaction to embryo destruction, rooted in ideas about sanctity, and then built the policy arguments. GMO opponents might feel an unease about unnaturalness and then focus on potential long-term safety risks. The energy is often moral first, intellectual second.
And Insight D flows directly from that. Resolution often requires a narrative shift. You rarely win by just burying your opponent in data. Often you need to offer a new story, a new frame, or maybe a technological fix that respects or bypasses their core values instead of directly attacking them.
The iPSC breakthrough is such an elegant example. The stem cell fight cooled so much because iPSCs offered that powerful narrative of medical progress without triggering the core value conflict over embryo destruction. It created a shared path forward.
Similarly, climate action gained more traction when the narrative shifted away from just saving polar bears or impending doom and towards tangible benefits like green jobs, energy independence, national security, and building resilience. It moved from primarily a sacrifice narrative to an opportunity narrative.
Insight E brings in the unavoidable reality of power and resources. Power dynamics explain outcomes more than intelligence. As we've seen, very intelligent, informed people land on opposite sides of these issues. Why? Because they prioritize different values or trust different experts.
And the sources really emphasize the role of privilege here. Your position in society shapes how much risk you can afford to take or ignore. If you're well off, maybe you can afford to be cautious and only buy expensive organic food. If you're struggling, price and availability might be your only concerns, making you more vulnerable to the downsides of, say, globalization or the potential risks of cheaper GM foods.
And ultimately, institutional power, the courts, legislatures, dominant industries, often determines which side's view gets enshrined in law or becomes the accepted norm. The GMO debate wasn't just science, it was also about the immense corporate power wielded by seed companies. Surveillance was about state secrecy and executive power. Power often dictates the resolution.
And finally, Insight F. Once a debate truly cools, holding the old minority position often becomes a cultural signal. It stops being primarily about the intellectual merits of the argument and becomes more about signaling identity, belonging, group affiliation.
Yet taking that old minority stance becomes a quick, clear way to show where you fit culturally. Opposing same-sex marriage today might be less about legal definitions and more about signaling commitment to traditional values or a specific religious community. Denying evolution can function as a badge of religious identity rather than a serious engagement with scientific evidence.
These fringe positions persist partly because they serve this cultural signaling function. They become identity anchors.
That's a brilliant synthesis. These debates, when you peel back the layers, are fundamentally about balancing our fear of losing tradition, security, maybe purity, with our hope for progress through science, equality, economic growth. The cooling happens when one side manages to capture the sense of legitimacy.
And maybe the final thought, the really provocative one for you to consider, is that controversy is just a stage in a longer process. It's not the final word. The core issue running through all of this seems to be trust. Who do we trust to interpret the world, to manage risks, to shape the future? When trust in institutions, science, government, media, tradition is fragmented, controversies explode. When trust realigns, maybe through a breakthrough, maybe through generational change, maybe through exhaustion, they cool down.
We've just spent time looking back 25 years. Now, think about today's hot-button issues, maybe even some viewpoints currently considered fringe. Which of those might, through these same forces, technology, generational shifts, a powerful new narrative, become the completely accepted, taken for granted norm 25 years from now? The cycle never really stops.